I'm John Buchanan, and in this video what we're going to do is to look at ChromaGlow, which is the new saturation plugin introduced with Logic Pro 11. Now, we've got a number of different distortion plugins which exist within Logic already, so what is different about ChromaGlow and what is saturation compared to distortion? All good questions. Before we find out the answers to them, let's just have a listen to the track that I've got programmed ready to demonstrate this plugin, and then we'll just have a look at its parameters before we go any further. Nice little bit of delay on the end there. Okay, so we've got this nice, smooth, chilled out track. Now what I want to do is to add a little bit of the kind of richness and saturation that ChromaGlow can provide to the drums. Now the reason I'm particularly picking that instrument is because the other sounds that I've chosen for this track have got a kind of nice retro quality to them already. So effectively the loops that I brought in, which have got electric pianos at their kind of core, have got that kind of slightly dusty, aged quality, which I really like. And to some extent that's also true of the bass line, this kind of upright bass, which is coming from the new studio bass instruments. But the drums have definitely got that kind of programmed, straight out of the box sort of feel, and I think a little bit of saturation will really help them. So what I'm going to do is to come to this Drum Machine Designer track, and what I'm going to do is to come and find ChromaGlow. Now this is going to be in our distortion folder, and ChromaGlow is here, and the G is capitalized. Go figure. So effectively we've got our ChromaGlow plugin, which is here. Now, effectively what we've got within this plugin is firstly 5 different models of saturation. Now I asked a question about saturation at the beginning of the video, let's answer it now. So effectively what happens when we pass signals through real circuits, and they come in different forms, we'll come back to that in a moment, is that they take on a different tonal color. So digital recordings effectively prioritize a transparency and a cleanness. Effectively what we want to do is we want to get the sound recorded that we can kind of hear in our rooms, and we want that to happen as transparently as possible. Or do we? It actually turns out that the color that comes from microphone choices, the preamps that we pass signals through, the vintage equipment that we might use to mic up a sound through and play back sounds through, all add a color and a quality which actually the ear really likes. And the reason the ear likes it is because effectively what we get is this harmonic distortion. So what happens when we take a signal and we harmonically distort it is that we add additional frequency content, and all distortion plugins do that to some extent. Whereas what ChromaGlow is effectively trying to do is to replicate the behavior of particular analog pieces of equipment, which effectively begin to saturate in interesting ways. And there are 5 separate models that allow us to do it. And we're actually going to work from the bottom and come back up to explain exactly what we've got going on. So if you think about an analog preamp, this is effectively, think about this as almost like being a channel on a mixing desk. We've got the preamplification stage of a piece of equipment which is going to allow us almost to kind of reamp this sound in a way that is by no means spectacular, but effectively is just going to give us the kind of warmth and color of, let's say, an SSL desk or a Neve desk, that kind of sense of a preamplification stage that's just going to warm the sound up a little bit. Squeeze is, to my ears, and I have no idea if this is true, very much like a kind of distressory kind of super compressed sound. Again, a sound being passed through a piece of analog equipment to pick up a super compressed, squeezed sound. I would have called that spank, but I can understand why they haven't. Okay, magnetic is all about tape. So this is effectively the idea of what happens when we record a sound to tape, and effectively we just slightly drive the input level. What happens if we really drive sounds onto tape is that they distort and they break up and they get too crunchy. But there's this really lovely sweet spot where effectively if we overdrive tape a little bit, we get this really oozy, wondrous sort of sound. Here come the adjectives. Okay, and now then what we've got above that is two types of tube sort of amplification, if you like. So effectively a modern and a retro version of what happens when we pass sounds through vacuum tubes and how they begin to light up when, again, we drive the sounds that hard. So the first thing we can do within ChromaGlow is to choose the model that we want to work with. And actually, to demonstrate what I mean about the difference of these, well, we'll listen to all of the different models, but to start with, I'm actually going to choose the magnetic tape model. And in a moment, what we'll do is just to solo these drums so we can hear them. But effectively, what we've then got is a subcategorization. I know I've made that sound quite boring now, but effectively we can choose our model, and then we've got two different types of flavor for each of those. And actually this parameter changes depending on which of these we choose. So for example, if I choose magnetic tape, I've got this idea of being able to add a kind of clean version of that, or something which is deliberately even more colorful and saturated, where we're going to kind of hype up those extra sort of harmonics, if you like. Whereas if I were, for example, to choose the squeeze algorithm, I get two kind of types of compression, one which is a bit more subtle than the other, and trust me, hard press is not subtle, which is kind of great. Okay, let's come back to the tape for a moment. Right, that's a lot of chat from me. Let's just actually have a listen to the difference between what happens when we simply start pushing up the amount of additional harmonics we're going to get when we select our model, choose our style, and then begin to introduce drive. Now, just before I press play, what we're going to see when we do press play is we're going to see the signal of the sound, the drums, coming into ChromaGlow, and the kind of red overlay that you're going to see is the drive amount. So as I push the drive level up, that red overlay will become a bit more hyped. I hope that makes sense. Here it comes. Now you can see straight away that if I choose the tape algorithm, magnetic here, I can actually get quite a long way into the kind of drive range before it makes it sound like a golf course. Nevertheless, I can get quite a long way into the drive range, let's just go with it, before we begin to really hear the effect of that. Whereas if I were to choose squeeze, for instance, and particularly if we were to choose the kind of hard press, and again, if I turn this right down, and then we begin to reduce it, we're going to hear this a lot more quickly. That little on the end is really nice. Okay, so effectively we've listened to two of the models, the tape and now this kind of squeeze algorithm, and we've seen that the the style changes depending on which of the models we've selected. Okay, so we now begin to understand, I hope, that this idea of kind of harmonic distortion can come through in a number of different ways depending on the type of processing that we're doing on a sound like this. Okay, so we're beginning also to hear that that harmonic content effectively is added now across the range. I've deliberately added this sound to a beat loop where we've got a kick drum and we've got a kind of hi-hat sort of at the top end, and we've got this kind of rim shot in the middle. So in other words, we've got bass and we've got mid-range and we've got treble. And of course, what happens, depending on the type of model that we're using, is that in some cases, the bottom end is going to get really overblown. That's particularly going to be true if I come back to the tubes, for instance. We'll choose one of these two options. Again, if I drive this, we're really going to hear what happens to the kick drum when we get up to higher drive values. Okay, so it's much, much, much more driven. And again, that gives us a chance to hear the difference between the modern tube and the more retro, subtler tube kind of model as well. Okay, so what if what I want to do is to add this amount of drive, but I don't want to completely decimate my kick drum? Well, that's what this button is for, and this frequency is for. This allows me to say, okay, I want to bypass the effect of ChromaGlow on frequencies below this frequency here. So whatever I choose, So if what I wanted to do is to say, yeah, I kind of want to preserve the sub bass and the kind of bass end of the kick without things getting too extreme, then effectively I can turn this option on and then choose my frequency. And that should be somewhat less overblown. Sure enough. Okay, now obviously at the moment I'm deliberately showing extreme versions of ChromaGlow. Drive is at 100%. But a couple more things to say, and let's dive with that particular point in mind straight up to the top right hand corner. Now, a little while ago I talked about, or in another episode, I talked about the fact that Beat Breaker's mix dial was one of my favorite features. The idea that we could create this really extreme effect, and then what we could do is decide how much of the portion of that signal would be given to the extreme effect of Beat Breaker. And the same thing is true here within ChromaGlow, that what we could do would be to say, yeah, I want loads and loads and loads of drive, but what I want to do is to mix that in with quite a lot of the original signal so that only a portion of the sound is allocated to this super overdriven effect. And that's really nice. And it's a very different effect from making mix 100%, but setting drive at 40%. This isn't going to produce the same sound. So remember, in the first example, the effect is really overblown and we're just hearing less of it. In this example, the effect is much less overblown and therefore it's more subtle for that reason. We've got a couple of other options up here as well. The idea that we can effectively use an input gain stage. In other words, I can drive the level input into ChromaGlow here. And what I can also do is to control its overall output level here. Although in some of, if not all of its models, I would say that some sort of limiting is taking place as part of the choice. It feels a little bit like if that level wasn't being regulated in some way, some of these more extreme 100% drive settings would be sending the signal further into the red. In fact, it hasn't even happened yet. So it feels a little bit like some sort of limiting is built in via there too. But if you do need to change level, you can absolutely do that here. Okay, and we've already seen what the drive level does. This is effectively setting the amount of drive, how much signal we're sending into ChromaGlow. Okay, now this is where the fun starts, because in addition to those settings, what we've also got is a chance to engage two separate filters at the bottom end and the top end of this signal. So we've got a low cut, otherwise known as a high pass filter, and we've got a high cut, otherwise known as a low pass filter. And these filters are outrageous. Okay, I'll explain what I mean. Firstly, what I'm going to do is to put a loop around this sound. Let's have a look at the high pass filter, otherwise known as the low cut. Now, a lot of people are getting tripped up by this. Firstly, turn it on. There's its power button. And really annoyingly, that is not an automatable parameter. Never mind. Okay, there nevertheless is our high pass filter. So effectively what I've done here is to turn it on. Now, when I say these filters are outrageous, what do I mean? Well, they are capable of extraordinary ranges of things. Now, the thing about filters is that effectively what we have a chance to do first is to choose the strength of those. If you imagine a signal being attenuated, in other words, dropped off in level, effectively, we can decide how extreme that signal level drop-off is going to be below a certain frequency. And that is determined by what's referred to as its slope. And lots of high-pass filters and low-pass filters have a maximum slope of 24 dB per octave. That's 24 decibels of volume drop for every octave we drop down our keyboards. 48 dB per octave is available here, which is outrageous. So effectively what we've got is this really extreme filter, which is really great, as we'll see in a moment. Turns out as well that this filter is resonant, so I've effectively got a chance to boost the volume at the frequency, cutoff frequency. In other words, what that means is the cutoff frequency is the point, the frequency at which filtering begins to occur. And what resonance does is to basically boost the volume at exactly that frequency, giving us this kind of slightly hyped effect or extremely hyped effect, depending on how much of that we choose to dial in. So our resonance is here. This is the frequency at which filtering is going to occur. And the slope determines how extremely that filter is going to work. Okay, here is what the 48 dB per octave filter sounds like on this sound. Let's start right down here at the bottom. It's amazing. Sounds absolutely great. It's, well, yeah, anyway, you heard it. So there we are. We're still using the modern tuber algorithm, which, as we know, is one of the more aggressive ones. Fine. I think that's sounding really, really good. Okay. Another thing to say is that we've got two options as far as this filtering is concerned. Now, again, this is really important to understand the balance now between the filter and the saturation stage. In other words, do we want to filter the signal before we send it into the saturator? Or do we want to saturate the signal and then filter it after the saturation has happened? Well, that's what the pre and post buttons are for. So if I select pre, effectively I'm filtering the sound and then sending it to the saturation stage. And remember, that means that we're going to be adding harmonic distortion at that point, which means that we might get back in some of the bass that we're currently filtering out, if that makes sense. Whereas if we go for the post option, what that really means is that all of the drive and all of the saturation is going to be added, and then we filter it, which means that effectively it's far more likely that we're going to be filtering out all of the bass because we're filtering it out after those extra harmonics have been added. I hope that makes sense. So that is a parameter tour of ChromaGlow, but it hasn't really demonstrated just how powerful this plugin is in terms of doing the job it's designed to do, which is to warm things up and provide more mixed context. Okay, what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to select the squeeze algorithm for a moment. I'm going to go for this slightly more driven, compressed sound. I'm going to turn off the filter, so effectively we're just talking about the sort of effect of the saturation stage, and I'm even going to turn off the bypass below frequency option as well, which means that we're just now adding saturation to the entire signal. Okay, what I'm going to do is to bypass the signal altogether, and now we're back to our clean, dry drums. They sound like this. And with ChromaGlow, now, in a sense, that's an unfair test because what, of course, ChromaGlow is doing, amongst other things, is to significantly boost level. So let's find out how much that's happening. If I reset this and we just press 4 bars of drums again, we're going to get a chance to see how loud this signal is without any of this processing. Okay, so it peaks at minus 9.4 decibels. And if I punch it in, okay, so it's 7 dB louder. Okay, so a fair test would be to take 7 decibels off the output signal, or thereabouts. So effectively what I have a chance to do now is that when I bypass this effect and we hear the original, and then I punch it in for the second half, it's not the level that is going to change, it's just the effect of that harmonic distortion. So with any luck, more or less the signals are now matched within a couple of tenths of a dB. But what we're going to get a chance to hear is what it sounds like to be adding this distortion. So I'm going to punch it in after 4 bars. Here it is, dry to start with. And now what I'm going to do is exactly the same thing, starting with it bypassed in the context of the track. just think that's so nice. The whole thing settles and it sits and it just feels warmer and richer. It feels like it behaves and belongs with, feels like it behaves. Feels like it belongs with the electric pianos and the kind of richness of the bass end. And that is with us having sort of trimmed the output level. Let's just see what happens if we try one of the other parameters. I'm going to go with magnetic this time. We're going to come back to the tape-based one. It felt like this was a little bit more subtle. I have no idea whether or not this attenuates volume to the same extent, so we're going to just wing it a little bit. And again, I'm going to do the same thing. We'll start with the original and then we'll punch it in. It's a voyage of discovery together. Okay, well that is a lot more subtle. We're now losing all of those 7 decibels of volume. So the only fair way to test that, see, that voyage of discovery ended up down a deep, dark road. Let's just try it one more time. I'll only give you 2 bars of audio and then we'll punch it in. Okay, so for my money, this is a really excellent addition to Logic's distortion options. Unlike many of the others, it's capable of real subtlety, and not just because it's got a mixed dial, but because there are 5 different models, all of which are capable of doing a really interesting and different sounding job. So straight away, you've got 5 different forms of potential saturation. We've got these 2 outrageously capable filters. And in fact, actually, you could just open up ChromaGlow, add no drive, and engage those filters. So effectively, you've got new filtering options within Logic 11 as well. But in combination, this limited but nevertheless really capable parameter set is giving us a whole new option for how we can add the kind of warmth and meltingly oozy wonder that can come from passing sounds through real circuits. And yes, I know it's a digital equivalent of actually doing that, but what an addition this is. I really do think this plugin is capable of amazing things. And I'm just adding it to the drums. You could put this on the output channel to warm up your mixes before, let's say, maybe Mastering Assistant, or as part of the process of just adding extra harmonics and therefore more richness and power to your mixes. Go check it out. It's really good.